Silence hangs over the world's greatest building sites. From the deserts of Egypt to the peaks of Peru, colossal stones lie half-carved, where ancient workers simply walked away. These abandoned megalithic quarries are not just ruins, they are frozen moments of crisis. By the end of this exploration, you will see these stones as a new kind of history book, one that reveals how power can evaporate in a single generation. What force is strong enough to make an empire abandon its most sacred project overnight? And what can a scattered set of tools tell us about a society's final days? How much of our own modern ambition is built on foundations just as fragile? A quarry is a place of purpose, of extraction and progress, but a megalithic quarry is something else entirely. It is a landscape of ambition carved directly into the earth, from the sun-baked granite of Aswan along the Nile to the cold, volcanic andesite cliffs near Ollantaytambo. These sites share a startling family resemblance. They are defined not by what was taken, but by what was left behind. The signature of these places is a profound and deliberate incompleteness. Here lies a 900-ton obelisk, its underside still clinging to the bedrock, as if the stone itself changed its mind. There, a squadron of stone hammers and bronze chisels lies scattered on the quarry floor, dropped in the middle of a task and never picked up. Ramps, causeways, and worker camps sit empty, their logistical purpose suddenly void. This is not the slow decline of a mine played out. This is a freeze frame. The global pattern is too specific, too dramatic to be coincidence. It points us away from simple explanations like a bad harvest or a lost battle. Instead, it suggests a fracture in the very system that made such monumental ambition possible in the first place. To understand why the work stopped, we must first understand the incredible machine that started it. That state of frozen incompleteness is our first and most powerful clue. It is a crime scene where the evidence has not been disturbed. At the unfinished obelisk in Aswan, you can still see the precise grooves left by teams of workers using stone pounders, a rhythmic, deafening process that shaped the granite inch by inch. The chisel marks are not worn down by time or weather. They are crisp, as if the worker simply set his tool down for a moment and never returned. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the stone of the pregnant woman, a block estimated at nearly 1,000 tons, lies in its quarry, partially undercut but still married to the living rock. The wooden wedges that workers hammered into channels to split the stone would have long since rotted away, but the channels themselves remain, a permanent record of an interrupted thought. This is what makes these sites so precious to archaeologists. Normally, we see ancient technology only through its finished products or through scattered tools found out of context. Here, we see the entire process caught in amber. We see the exact method for separating a 200-ton block from a cliff face. We see the staging areas, the ramps at their precise angle of construction, the worker camps still laid out for the next shift. The abandonment was so total, so swift, that there was no time for a salvage operation. No one came back to collect the valuable bronze tools. No one repurposed the finely dressed stones for a smaller, humbler project. The entire colossal enterprise, with all its logistics and skilled labor, simply switched off, and that tells us something critical about the nature of the crisis that caused it. This was not a slow wind down. It was not a king saying, "You know, this temple is getting too expensive, let us scale back the plans." Those scenarios leave a messier, more gradual archaeological record. What we find in these quarries is the signature of a sudden stop. It suggests an event so overwhelming that it instantly dissolved the authority that commanded the work, or presented a threat so immediate and existential that every single able-bodied person was needed elsewhere for survival. The work did not taper off, it was severed. And in that severance we find a stark message about the fragility of power. The most ambitious project of a civilization, the very symbol of its gods and kings, can be abandoned overnight when the system that feeds it collapses. The stones, then, are not just monuments to ambition, but to its astonishingly sudden end. That frozen moment in the quarry itself is only half the story. To move a single one of these multi-ton stones required a civilization operating at the peak of its organizational power. It was a symphony of logistics, and when the music stopped, every instrument was left in place. Surrounding each of these sites, archaeologists find the sprawling, practical skeleton of the operation. This is our second profound clue. Worn roads fan out from the quarry floor, their surfaces grooved by countless sledges. Earthen ramps built at precise, calculated angles rise against quarry walls, their construction phases visible like tree rings. Nearby, the foundations of worker settlements sit quietly, their layouts speaking of order and routine. And sometimes there are storage depots, still containing the surplus food, tools, and supplies meant to fuel the next phase of work. The state of this entire logistical web is a direct reflection of the crisis that ended it. If a society were winding down a project slowly, through economic hardship or a shift in priorities, we would see evidence of salvage. Those valuable wooden beams from the ramps would be pulled out for other construction. The stones from temporary causeways would be repurposed, the worker camps would be dismantled, their materials taken back to nearby towns. But that is not what we find at these sudden abandonment sites. Instead, the ramps stand unfinished, their construction baskets and lever stones still lying where they were dropped. The roads are not overgrown with new settlements, they simply fade back into the landscape unused. The storage pits are found with their contents intact, a clear sign that there was no orderly retreat, no planned redistribution of resources. This paints a picture of an evacuation, not a downsizing. It tells us the labor force did not slowly drift away to other jobs. They were called away all at once by an imperative that overrode everything. The most telling detail of all is the sheer scale of what was left idling. Feeding, housing, and coordinating hundreds, sometimes thousands of skilled workers and their supporting families was a colossal economic undertaking. It represented a massive investment of a society's surplus, its wealth, and its administrative muscle. For a central authority to walk away from that investment, to let it all go to waste, means only one thing. The return on that investment, the political power, the religious legitimacy, the king's immortal glory, had instantly become irrelevant. The social contract that compelled people to contribute their labor, whether through devotion, duty, or simple necessity, had shattered. The central power could no longer command the obedience, or more practically, could no longer secure the food and security required to keep the machine running. So the machine stopped completely and forever, leaving behind a perfect snapshot of its own immense capability and of the stunning suddenness of its silence. The stone itself holds the third and perhaps most revealing clue. A quarry is not just a hole in the ground, it is a deliberate choice. Why dig here and not a mile over? Why wrestle with this brutally hard granite when softer limestone is readily available? The answer is written in the rock, and it speaks of a society's deepest beliefs. The pursuit of a specific stone was never just about engineering, it was about ideology. Take the unfinished obelisk in Aswan. The ancient Egyptians did not just want big stones, they wanted red granite. This stone, with its incredible durability and its fiery, speckled appearance, was directly linked to the sun god Ra. To erect an obelisk of this material was to capture a sliver of the divine, to make a statement in stone that would outlast the ages themselves. The quarry at Aswan was not just a convenient source of strong rock, it was a sacred landscape, the only place to get the material that could properly honor the gods and glorify the pharaoh, who was himself a living god. So when work at such a place stops forever, it is not merely a construction project being cancelled. It is a theological statement being revoked. Abandoning a prime, ideologically charged source like Aswan's granite quarries signals a profound rupture. It could mean the religious doctrine that demanded that specific stone has lost its power. Perhaps a new ruling faction has come to power, with a different patron deity who required a different symbolic material, like the dark basalt of a northern volcano. Or perhaps the specialized knowledge required to identify, extract, and work that particular stone has been lost in a single generation. The master quarrymen who could read the cracks in the bedrock, who knew the exact angle to drive wooden wedges into the granite to make it split true, may have been part of a vanished class. Their expertise was not written down in manuals, it was passed from hand to eye, from experienced elder to apprentice. If that chain is broken by conflict, by a sudden dispersal of the population, or by the collapse of the guilds that protected such knowledge, then the quarry becomes more than abandoned. It becomes incomprehensible. The perfect block half released from the earth is no longer a resource. It is a monument to forgotten wisdom. The geological fingerprint, therefore, tells a story of identity. What a culture builds with, and where it chooses to build from, is a declaration of who it is and what it believes. To walk away from that source is to admit, whether by choice or by brutal necessity, that the old declaration no longer holds. The stone remains, waiting for hands that will never come, a silent testament to a world that changed its mind. The scattered tools and silent ramps present a puzzle. Was this the end of a long, slow fade, or the echo of a single, shattering event? For archaeologists, this distinction is everything. It is the difference between a society gently releasing its ambitions and one having them ripped away. The evidence on the ground speaks two very different languages. A site abandoned through gradual decline tells a story of managed retreat. You might find signs of systematic salvage. Valuable metal tools would be collected and melted down for reuse. Wooden beams from ramps and sledges would be pulled out for firewood or smaller construction projects. The workforce might be strategically redirected to a newer, perhaps more defensible building site, leaving the old quarry not in chaos, but in a state of orderly mothballing. This pattern suggests causes like long-term economic strain, a slow shift in trade routes, or the creeping fragmentation of political power, where a central authority loses its grip over decades. It is a story of diminishing returns where the cost of glory finally outweighs its benefit. The quarries that capture our imagination, however, scream a different truth. They show the signature of a sudden stop. This is not a managed retreat, it is an evacuation. The proof is in the undisturbed disorder. A stone hammer lies where it fell from a worker's hand mid-swing. A pot of grain or a stash of dried fish sits in a storage pit left to decay. Most tellingly, partially extracted blocks are left in precarious, unstable positions. No competent foreman, even in a time of slowdown, would leave a 900-ton obelisk undercut and unsupported if he planned to return next season. That is an act of walking away from a capital investment and a safety hazard simultaneously. It only makes sense if the people leaving believe or know they are never coming back. This frozen panic points toward triggers that are acute and overwhelming. It hints at an imminent invading force requiring every able-bodied person to defend the walls. It suggests a rapid, devastating shift in the climate, like a prolonged drought that collapsed the food supply in a handful of years. Or it points to a swift-moving health crisis that ravaged the population and shattered the chain of command in a frighteningly short time. These are not slow burn problems. They are crises that hit a complex society like a hammer blow, severing the delicate threads of logistics, authority, and shared purpose in one fell swoop. The quarries we have been exploring, with their tools littering the floor and their grandest stones still captive in the earth, overwhelmingly whisper of this second, more dramatic end. They are not monuments to a fading dream, but to a waking nightmare that arrived in a single season. The sheer scale of the unfinished obelisk in Aswan is almost impossible to grasp until you stand beside it. This single shaft of red granite, if completed, would have stood over 130 feet tall and weighed nearly 1,200 tons. It remains today exactly as the ancient workers left it, partially separated from the living bedrock of the quarry, a monument to ambition interrupted. The visible crack running through its length is often presented as the simple reason for its abandonment, a flaw that made the stone useless. But that crack is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a much deeper mystery. A flaw in a single stone, even one this colossal, would not have halted an entire tradition. The pharaohs of Egypt had faced broken obelisks before. They would simply command their master quarrymen to start again, to extract another perfect block from the endless red granite of the Aswan hills. The true significance of this site is not that one obelisk was left unfinished, but that the obelisk-making era itself, a defining project of pharaonic power for centuries, began to wind down around this time. This quarry marks not a technical failure, but a profound cultural and political turning point. Commissioned during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful rulers, the obelisk was born in an age of supreme confidence. Erecting these towering needles of stone was the ultimate act of royal propaganda. They were statements in granite, claiming a pharaoh's direct connection to the sun god, Ra, and broadcasting their eternal glory across the landscape. The work required an almost unimaginable investment. Thousands of skilled laborers, engineers, and overseers had to be housed, fed, and coordinated for years. The logistics of moving a 1,000-ton stone from the quarry to the Nile, then barging it downstream to its final sacred site, represented the peak of ancient organizational power. So when this practice began to fade, it was not because the engineers forgot how to do it. It was because the world around them changed. The period following Hatshepsut's reign was one of increasing pressure. To the north, the expanding Hittite Empire began to challenge Egyptian dominance, demanding constant military campaigns that drained the treasury and diverted manpower from monumental works. Internally, religious beliefs were shifting. The radical reforms of a later pharaoh, Akhenaten, who attempted to replace the entire pantheon of gods with the worship of a single solar deity, created profound social and theological instability. Even after his death and the restoration of the old gods, the unquestioned authority of the pharaoh as the sole divine intermediary had been shaken. In this new reality, the priorities of the state necessarily changed. The incredible cost of carving and raising a single obelisk, a project that consumed a kingdom's surplus for a decade, began to seem like a luxury it could no longer afford. Resources once dedicated to eternal glory were now urgently needed for earthly security, for fortifying borders and maintaining armies. The unfinished obelisk, therefore, is far more than a broken stone. It is a physical manifestation of a calculated decision made at the highest levels of power. The crack may have been the official reason work stopped, a convenient excuse that saved royal face. But the deeper truth is that the political will to try again evaporated. The return on investment had fundamentally changed. Where once a giant obelisk guaranteed a pharaoh's legacy and pleased the gods, now that same wealth spent on soldiers and forts might guarantee the kingdom's survival. The abandonment of this specific quarry site signals the moment when the new kingdom's leaders, perhaps reluctantly, began to trade monuments of eternity for the immediate demands of a more precarious world. The tools were left where they lay because the age they were built for was already passing. The silent quarry at Aswan does not just show us where work stopped, it shows us the precise point where an empire's ambition collided with its new reality and was forced to choose. While Egypt's obelisks were statements to the gods, the stones of Baalbek were a declaration to the world. In the fertile Bekaa Valley of modern-day Lebanon, the Romans built the sanctuary of Heliopolis, a sprawling complex of temples dedicated to Jupiter, Venus, and Bacchus. Its scale was designed to awe, to demonstrate the absolute supremacy of Rome in a culturally rich and strategic province. But just outside the main complex, in a quarry that supplied its most colossal stones, lies a different kind of monument. It is known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a single block of limestone estimated to weigh around 1,000 tons. Unlike the obelisk in Aswan, this stone was not left half-carved in the bedrock. It was fully extracted, perfectly shaped, and ready for transport, and there it sits in its own cradle of earth, exactly where Roman engineers left it nearly 2,000 years ago. This is not a story of a broken stone, but of a broken system. The block itself is a triumph of engineering. To free a mass this size from the quarry floor required phenomenal skill. Workers would have carved deep trenches around it, then tunneled beneath to insert wooden supports. On the day of the lift, those supports would be burned away, dropping the monolith onto a prepared bed of gravel and sand, a controlled descent that prevented it from shattering. They succeeded, the stone was liberated, and then nothing. Its very readiness is the mystery. Moving it would have been the next, even more impossible task. Calculations suggest it would have required the coordinated pull of several thousand men, moving in perfect unison along a greased roadway, with a logistical tail of cooks, medics, and overseers stretching for miles. This was the muscle of empire made manifest. Yet the empire chose not to flex it. The likely reason lies in the calendar. The peak of construction at Baalbek coincides with a period of relative stability in the 2nd century AD. But by the 3rd century, Rome was unraveling. This was the era of the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period where the empire nearly collapsed under a perfect storm of pressures. The throne became a prize fought over by rival generals, leading to constant civil war. Rampant inflation destroyed the economy, making it difficult to pay the very armies fighting those wars. And on every frontier, from the Germanic tribes in the north to the Sasanian Persians in the east, invasions pressed inward. In this atmosphere of existential emergency, priorities shifted with brutal speed. The imperial treasury, once deep enough to fund temples that touched the sky, was now desperately needed to pay soldiers and shore up disintegrating borders. The vast, organized workforce required for such a megalithic move was no longer a source of pride. It was a critical resource that needed to be militarized. Skilled engineers and laborers were pulled from construction sites and sent to fortify city walls or build siege engines. The Stone of the Pregnant Woman, therefore, is a stark lesson in imperial overreach. It represents a project conceived at the dizzying height of power, a statement of what Rome believed it could always do. Its abandonment is the signature of an empire that suddenly, terrifyingly, realized it could not. The stone is a promise the future could not keep. It shows that an empire's greatest ambitions are not just limited by technology or manpower, but by time itself. The centralized authority that greenlit such a feat proved to be a fleeting thing, vulnerable to the tremors of history, so the block remains a perfect and poignant symbol. It is not a failure of engineering, but a fossil of political will. It marks the precise moment when the boundless confidence of an empire met the hard, practical limits of a crisis and was forced to let its grandest stone lie. The story shifts now to a different kind of stone in a different kind of empire. High in the thin air of the Peruvian Andes, the quarries of Ollantaytambo cling to a mountainside across a river valley from the fortress complex they were meant to supply. Here, the stone is a striking pink rhyolite, a volcanic rock that glows with a warm, almost ethereal light when the sun strikes it. The Incas chose this material not for its ease of work, but for its beauty and its symbolic connection to the sacred landscape. The site is a masterpiece of planning, with a network of roads, ramps, and slides carved directly into the steep terrain to lower the massive blocks toward the valley floor. Yet, like Aswan and Baalbek, it is a masterpiece left dramatically unfinished. Dozens of perfectly cut, multi-ton blocks lie scattered along the transport route, some still poised on stone rollers, as if the workers paused for a midday meal and never returned. The scale of what was left behind speaks of an enterprise operating at full capacity and then stopping dead. The timing here provides a chillingly clear answer. This quarry's silence coincides directly with the cataclysm of the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. This was not a slow internal decay. It was a civilization hitting a wall. Under the leadership of Manco Inca, who initially collaborated with the Spanish before leading a fierce rebellion, the Inca Empire faced an existential threat unlike any other. The invaders brought steel, horses, and diseases that ravaged the population, but they also represented a complete ideological rupture. The Spanish sought not just territory, but the total dismantling of the Inca religious and social order. In this desperate context, the beautiful pink stones of Ollantaytambo took on a new, urgent meaning. They were no longer just elements of a temple to honor the sun god Inti. They became components of a last stand. The fortress of Ollantaytambo itself was transformed into a formidable stronghold, its terraces converted into defensive walls. And the quarry across the river, its purpose was instantly redefined. The skilled stonemasons, the teams of laborers hauling on ropes, the engineers calculating angles of descent, all of them were warriors now. Every able hand was needed to build barricades, to stockpile food, to prepare for siege. The quarry was abandoned not because the Incas lost their knowledge or their faith, but because they were forced to make a brutal, immediate choice. The labor of generations intended for eternal glory was redirected into the project of sheer survival. This site shows us power in its most fluid and reactive state. A civilization's monumental ambition can be repurposed overnight when a greater force demands it. The abandoned blocks at Ollantaytambo are therefore a unique kind of historical record. They are not symbols of a collapsed dream, but of a defiant, pragmatic pivot. They mark the moment when an empire stopped building for its gods and started building for its life, leaving the stones of eternity waiting on the mountainside, while the fight for the present raged just across the river. The silent quarries hold another secret, one written not in stone but in absence. Who were the hands that wielded these tools, and what does their sudden vanishing act tell us about the society they served? The answer is far more complex than we once assumed. For generations, the popular image was of vast armies of slaves, driven by the lash to move mountains for a distant king. But the archaeology of these sites is quietly rewriting that narrative. The evidence suggests a workforce of astonishing specialization. At many quarries, we find tools of remarkable quality and consistency, designed for specific, expert tasks. These are not the crude implements of brute force, but the refined instruments of a master craft. The stone hammers at Aswan show careful selection for weight and balance. The bronze chisels left at Baalbek represent a significant investment of metal, a valuable resource. You do not issue tools like these to a disposable labor force you expect to wear down and replace. You issue them to artisans whose skill is an asset to be protected. This points toward a class of highly trained, perhaps even revered, workers. They might have been conscripted through a system of labor duty, a tax paid in work that was part of the social contract of the time. Or they could have been members of hereditary guilds, families who held the secret knowledge of how to speak to stone, passing techniques from father to son for generations. Their status likely sat somewhere between compelled service and honored profession, bound to the state by a mix of duty, tradition, and the tangible rewards of being part of a civilization's most prestigious project. This makes their disappearance all the more significant. When these sites are abandoned, we find those valuable tools left right on the quarry floor. In an orderly retreat, the state would have reclaimed that bronze, that finely shaped stone. The fact that it remains suggests the binding force, whatever it was, snapped all at once. If it was coercion, then the guards and overseers lost their power in an instant, and the workers simply walked away from their posts. If it was a system of loyal duty, then that loyalty evaporated when the central authority that commanded it ceased to function or to provide security in return. The absence of human remains in most of these scenarios is particularly telling. It rules out a sudden, site-specific catastrophe like a quarry collapse or an attack that trapped everyone inside. Instead, it points to a deliberate, organized exodus. The workforce left, and they left together. This mass walk-off is one of the most powerful social statements we can read from the past. It represents the moment when the populace, or a critical segment of it, stopped recognizing the authority of the elite. The grand narrative of the king, the temple, the eternal glory, it lost its compelling power. Perhaps a more immediate threat, like an invading army or a famine, demanded everyone's attention for survival. Or perhaps the social contract itself had broken, and the people decided the stones of the gods were no longer worth their sweat when their own children were hungry. The vanished labor force is the ultimate clue. It shows that the true foundation of these megalithic wonders was not just engineering or geology, but a fragile web of human agreement. When that web tore, the ambition it supported came crashing down, leaving behind only the silent stones and the scattered tools of a partnership that had suddenly, decisively ended. That vanished workforce left behind more than just tools. They left a financial crater. Think of the logistics we have already traced, the ramps and roads and settlements, and now assign a price tag to every single piece. Extracting and moving a single megalith was arguably the ancient world's most capital-intensive endeavor. It was not just about manpower, it was about consuming a kingdom's surplus. Every day of work required vast stores of food to feed thousands of specialized laborers and their families. It consumed timber by the acre for sledges, rollers, and the scaffolding of ramps. It required miles of rope woven from hemp or leather. It used up valuable copper and tin to forge the bronze chisels that slowly shaped the stone. This was not a project funded by a royal treasury sitting on a pile of gold coins. It was funded by the entire economic engine of the state, an engine that ran on agricultural surplus and the steady flow of tribute from conquered lands. A suddenly abandoned quarry, therefore, represents more than a paused project. It represents a sunk cost of truly colossal proportions. All that food, all that timber, all that metal and manpower had been spent with zero return. No temple was completed, no obelisk was raised to glorify a pharaoh. The investment simply evaporated. This economic hemorrhage would have drained state reserves to a dangerous degree. To understand the shockwave, consider a modern analogy. Imagine a nation today pouring billions into constructing a new capital city, with skyscrapers half built and highways leading nowhere, and then the government simply walks away, leaving the cranes still and the bank accounts empty. The ripple effects would be catastrophic. In the ancient world, the effects were just as severe but far more direct. The grain consumed by quarry workers was grain not stored for a lean year. The skilled artisans diverted to moving stone were not forging plows or repairing irrigation canals. The economic foundation of these societies, often based on a delicate balance of tribute and taxation, was being strained to its limit to feed the ambition of the monument. So when a crisis hit, whether an invasion, a drought, or a dynastic struggle, the ruling power faced a brutal calculation. They could continue pouring what little remained into the symbolic project, or they could cut their losses and redirect every last resource to immediate survival. The fact that they chose to walk away from such a massive investment is one of the most definitive economic indicators we have. it tells us, in no uncertain terms, that the treasury had run out of reserves, that the lines of credit with regional governors or temple estates had snapped. It signals that the economic foundation itself, the steady flow of goods and labor that made the empire possible, had collapsed. The engine of monumental construction ran on a specific kind of fuel, a surplus of wealth and stability. When that fuel ran out, the engine did not just slow down, it seized, and the silent, half-carved stones are the perfect fossils of that economic seizure, proving that even the grandest visions of power are ultimately built on something as fragile as a good harvest and the willingness of people to pay their taxes. The tools left behind were not just objects, they were extensions of a mind. The true technology of the megalith was not in the stone hammer, but in the generations of experience that taught a worker exactly where to strike. This knowledge was the most vital and most fragile resource of all. Megalithic quarrying and construction was not brute force. It was an applied science, a deep conversation between human intelligence and the Earth's own geology. It required specialists who could read the mountain like a book, identifying hidden fracture lines in the granite that would allow a 500-ton block to split cleanly away. It demanded engineers who understood how to dress a stone with such precise, interlocking marks that it would fit a neighboring block without mortar, a puzzle solved centuries before construction even began. It needed the artisans who could design the perfect sledge, calculate the exact slope of a ramp, or carve a temporary water channel to lubricate a pathway. This was not common knowledge. This was a protected craft passed down through guilds or within families, from master to apprentice over a lifetime of careful observation and practice. The chain of transmission was as delicate as it was powerful. An abrupt generational abandonment of a quarry does more than halt a project, it severs that chain. When the workers at Ollantaytambo or Aswan walked away, they took with them something far more valuable than their bronze chisels. They took the unspoken rules, the intuitive feel for the material, the hard-won tricks of the trade that were never written down. They took the living library. The consequences of this loss become starkly clear when we look at the historical record after such collapses. In post-Roman Europe, the astonishing concrete vaults and aqueducts of the empire gave way to simpler stonework and timber. The precise formulas for that waterproof concrete, the engineering principles for spanning vast spaces, faded from memory. In the Andes, after the trauma of conquest and rebellion, the later colonial structures built atop Inca foundations used smaller, rougher stones held together with copious mortar. The sublime, earthquake-resistant technique of fitting massive stones together without any adhesive had become a lost art. This is what historians sometimes call a technological regression. It is not that people became less intelligent. It is that a complex system of specialized knowledge, one that required a stable, supportive society to sustain its teaching and practice, was dismantled in a single, turbulent generation. The quarry, therefore, transforms in our understanding. It is not merely an abandoned work site. It becomes the tomb of an intellectual tradition. The half-carved stone is a fossilized thought, a brilliant idea frozen in mid-sentence. This highlights a profound and often overlooked fragility. The pyramids, the great walls, the towering temples, they stand as testaments to human ambition. But their silent, unfinished counterparts testify to something else. They remind us that our most advanced know-how does not reside in blueprints or libraries alone. It lives in the practiced hands and shared memories of a community. When that community is scattered or its purpose shattered, the knowledge can evaporate as suddenly as the authority that commanded it, leaving behind only the mute stones and the haunting question of what we, in our own time, might be one generation away from forgetting. Nature, in the end, is the ultimate authority. For all the power of kings and the devotion of priests, the most ambitious human projects are still subject to the earth's own rhythms and sudden rages. Environmental stress is the silent partner in many of these abandonments, a force that could cripple the logistical machine overnight. A quarry is not an isolated factory. It is a living system integrated into the landscape. Its survival depends on a steady flow of resources, and when that flow stops, everything grinds to a halt. Consider the essential need for water. In places like Aswan, the Nile was the only viable highway for moving those colossal stones. Granite obelisks were loaded onto massive barges during the annual flood, when the river was high and powerful enough to bear their impossible weight. A series of weak floods or a prolonged drought would not just delay the project, it would erase the very possibility of transport. The stone might be perfectly carved, but it would be a prisoner in its own quarry, with no way to reach its sacred destination. Similarly, the thousands of workers and their families required a constant supply of fresh water and food. A drought that withered the regional grain supply would force a brutal choice: feed the population or feed the monument. The monument always loses. In the Andes, the threat was often more violent. Seismic activity is woven into the geology of the region. A powerful earthquake could do more than shake the ground. It could fracture a prized monolith already under tension from the extraction process, rendering years of work instantly worthless. It could collapse the intricate network of stone causeways and ramps built into the mountainside, turning a masterwork of engineering into an impassable ruin of rubble. Rebuilding that infrastructure would require another massive investment of time and labor, resources a society in crisis might no longer possess. Then there is the slower, more insidious trigger: resource depletion itself. The scale of these operations was environmentally voracious. Moving a single megalith required vast quantities of timber for sledges, rollers, and levers. It consumed acres of forest for the fires needed to heat stones for splitting, or to create the charcoal for metalworkers forging tools. In a closed system where all materials are sourced locally, a project could quite literally deforest its own landscape. When the last suitable trees were cut from the surrounding hillsides, the operation would hit a wall. You cannot move a 1,000-ton stone without the strong, straight logs to roll it on. This local ecological collapse would not just pause the quarry, it would permanently end its feasibility, forcing a sudden and absolute reckoning with the limits of the environment. Until recently, these environmental triggers were educated guesses based on historical accounts and archaeological context. Now, science is providing the hard evidence. Researchers are turning to paleoclimatic data, the ancient weather records locked away in ice cores from glaciers and sediment layers at the bottom of lakes. By analyzing things like pollen counts, mineral deposits, and isotopic signatures, they can reconstruct precise climate histories, year by year, century by century. The emerging pattern is striking. Time and again, the carbon-dated moment of a quarry's abandonment aligns perfectly with a severe, multi-year drought recorded in an ice core from a nearby mountain peak, or with a layer of silt indicating catastrophic erosion from deforested hills. This correlation is changing the narrative. It suggests that environmental shocks were frequently the immediate, undeniable crisis, the smoking gun that forced a society's hand. A drought did not just cause a bad harvest, it snapped the final, strained thread of a complex economic and social system. It exposed vulnerabilities that had been papered over by imperial grandeur, revealing that the foundation of power was not just political or religious, but profoundly ecological. The abandoned quarry, then, becomes a stark lesson in sustainability. It marks the point where a civilization's monumental ambition finally outran the carrying capacity of its land. The stones remain not as symbols of a lost dream, but as permanent markers on a graph, showing the exact moment when the environment presented its bill, and the account was suddenly, irrevocably closed. But what happens when the heavens themselves change? The most profound reason for abandoning a sacred quarry may have had nothing to do with logistics or warfare. It could be that the gods who demanded the stone were no longer listening. In the ancient world, monumental stone was rarely just a building material. It was theology made physical. An Egyptian obelisk was not a mere monument, it was a frozen ray of the sun god Ra, a direct conduit for divine energy piercing the sky. An Inca andesite block was not simply a wall component, it was an embodiment of ancestral power, a literal piece of the living mountain revered as a deity. The quarry that supplied such material was therefore a consecrated space, a direct link in a chain of meaning that connected the earth, the ruler, and the cosmos. To walk away from that specific site was not merely an economic decision. It could be an act of profound theological revolution. Consider the possibility of a sudden, top-down reformation. A new pharaoh ascends the throne, one who has experienced a powerful vision or who seeks to break the entrenched power of a rival priesthood. He declares that the old pantheon of gods is obsolete. Perhaps he elevates a previously minor deity to supreme status, or he attempts, as Akhenaten did, to replace the entire complex system with the worship of a single solar disk. In an instant, the ideological foundation of the state is rewritten. The grand temple project dedicated to the old god Ammon, which required a specific, ritually pure stone from a specific quarry, is no longer a sacred duty. It is now a monument to a discredited faith, a potential source of spiritual pollution. The quarry workers are not called away to fight a battle. They are instructed to stop because the project itself has become spiritually dangerous. The tools are left in place because the very purpose they served has been erased by decree. This kind of abandonment leaves a unique signature in the archaeological record. There is no evidence of a rushed evacuation for war, no stockpiled food left to rot from a sudden famine. Instead, we might see a site left in a state of orderly suspension, as if waiting for instructions that never came because the theological blueprint had been burned. This reveals a subtle but powerful truth about how civilizations transform. We often look for shifts in power in the obvious places, in the ashes of sacked cities or the records of depleted treasuries. But some of the most decisive revolutions are silent ones, fought not with swords but with ideas. A change in official state religion represents a seismic reordering of reality. It redefines what is sacred, what is worthy of a society's greatest effort, and what must be forgotten. In this context, a half-carved obelisk is more than an unfinished task, it is a fossilized belief. Its abandonment marks the exact moment a culture's spiritual compass spun to a new north. The stones themselves become casualties of a changing heaven, left behind because the voices that commanded their creation had been suddenly, irrevocably silenced. This suggests that the ultimate foundation of these megalithic wonders was not just engineering or economics, but a shared story, a collective agreement about the nature of the universe and humanity's place within it. When that story is rewritten by those in power, the most ambitious chapters can be left permanently unfinished, a silent testament to the fact that the most solid things we build are often held together by the most fragile of ideas, the faith of a generation. Sometimes the stones themselves bear the marks of a violent end. A quarry's silence can be punctuated by evidence not of a peaceful departure, but of a sudden, shattering attack. In these places, the narrative shifts from logistical collapse to a scene of conflict. We move from wondering why workers left to understanding why they fled. The tools found are not merely dropped, they are sometimes deliberately smashed, perhaps to prevent their use by an enemy. A perfectly shaped monolith, nearly ready for transport, might be found toppled from its sledges, broken in a way that suggests not an accident, but an act of sabotage. This is a different kind of abandonment, one charged with fear and urgency. It speaks of a threat that arrived not as a slow drought, but as a visible army on the horizon. In border regions, quarries were particularly vulnerable. a site producing stone for a king's new palace, located near a contested frontier, would be an obvious target for a rival power. Destroying or halting such a project was a direct blow to the enemy's prestige and a clear message of dominance. In these scenarios, the workers did not have the luxury of a slow walk-off. The state would have issued an immediate conscription order. The master stone carver, the ramp engineer, the teamster who knew how to coax a 200-ton block down a mountainside, they would all be handed spears instead of chisels. Their irreplaceable skills mattered less in that moment than their ability to hold a line. The quarry's value instantly transformed from economic to strategic. Its location, its store of heavy stones, even its excavated trenches, could be repurposed for defense. There are sites in the Andes where archaeologists see this pivot in the very layout of the land. A quarry's access road, once built for moving massive loads, shows signs of being barricaded. High points around the excavation are fortified with rough stone walls, suggesting a last stand was made there. The quarry did not just stop being a workshop, it became a redoubt, a final fortress where people made a desperate attempt to turn the tools of creation into instruments of survival. The most direct evidence comes from signs of fire, layers of ash and soot overlying workshop areas, or the remnants of burned wooden sledges and ramps, point to a deliberate scorching, either by defenders to deny resources or by attackers to ensure the site could not be revived. Occasionally, the chilling discovery of projectile points, arrowheads or spear tips embedded in the quarry walls or scattered among the debris tells a story no tool inventory ever could. This was not an evacuation, it was a battle. When conflict is the cause, the abandonment carries a unique finality. A project halted by economic strain might be revived by a later, wealthier dynasty. A quarry paused for theological reasons might be reconsecrated under a new religious order, but a site ravaged by war, its infrastructure burned, its skilled workforce scattered or lost, its very location now synonymous with violence and defeat, stands little chance of revival. The memory of the conflict becomes part of the site's identity, a ghost that lingers in the scorch marks and the broken stone. This reveals a profound and unsettling truth about the trajectory of civilizations. The energy required to conceive and execute these monumental works is the same energy that fuels empires, that drives expansion and cultural expression. But that energy is not infinite. When challenged by an external force, it can be redirected in an instant from creation to destruction, from building up to tearing down, or simply to holding on. The quarries that show these scars are monuments to that pivot. They freeze the moment a society's highest cultural aspirations were overtaken by its most basic instinct to survive. The half-raised stone, toppled and forgotten, becomes a stark symbol of a war that no one won, a conflict that consumed the future along with the present, leaving only silent stones where the dreams of peace once took shape. A crack in the stone, they said, was a sign from the gods. For the people who came centuries after the last Egyptian workers left Aswan, the unfinished obelisk was a mystery beyond their own engineering. They could not conceive of a human society simply choosing to walk away from such a colossal endeavor, so they wove a story. The crack that snakes through the granite was not a natural flaw or an extraction error, it was divine displeasure made manifest. The gods themselves had split the stone, halting the work of a prideful pharaoh. This was not an isolated act of imagination. Across the world, at Baalbek, medieval European travelers and local folklore looked upon the 1,000-ton monoliths and saw the work of giants, or the legendary builder King Nimrod from biblical tradition. These narratives are far more than fanciful tales. They are profound cultural reactions, born from a specific kind of awe. When faced with a technological achievement that seems to dwarf your own world's capabilities, the mind searches for an explanation that fits its own framework of reality. If your society does not build with 1,000-ton stones, then the beings who did must not have been entirely human. They must have been giants, demigods, or a race blessed by heaven. This process of myth-making is a second, quieter power shift that occurs long after the original civilization falls. It represents the loss of historical memory, the complete erasure of the practical, human-scale truth. The knowledge of the guilds, the names of the engineers, the economic pressures and political calculations, all of it fades into dust. What remains is the sheer, intimidating scale of the object itself, stripped of its context. And into that vacuum of understanding, a new culture pours its own beliefs, its own fears, and its own needs. These stories often serve a powerful legitimizing function for new ruling powers. By attributing the ruins to biblical giants or god-like ancestors, a new kingdom can claim a connection to a mythic, more powerful age, or define the landscape as one where divine forces once walked, thereby sanctifying their own right to rule that same land. The original purpose of the stone is overwritten. A quarry meant to glorify a pharaoh becomes a lesson in hubris. A temple platform intended to showcase Roman might becomes proof of a giant's playground. The narrative itself becomes a tool of power, repurposing the past to explain and justify the present. This reveals a haunting truth about how civilizations measure themselves. A society's greatest monuments are not just judged by the generation that builds them, but by every generation that comes after, who will see in those stones a reflection of their own beliefs, their own limitations, and their own need to find a story that makes the world feel ordered and known. The silent quarries, therefore, are not just abandoned by their builders. They are forever being reclaimed not by new workers but by new stories. The geographical stage on which a civilization performed its megalithic drama fundamentally shaped its final act. To understand the true nature of a power shift, we must look beyond the quarry itself to its place on the map. Was it the heart of an isolated world, or a single node in a vast, humming network of trade and empire? The difference between total collapse and strategic retreat is often written in the stone and in the distance to the nearest neighbor. Consider two quarries separated by an ocean. On one side, the soft volcanic tuff cliffs of Rororoku on Easter Island. Here, the iconic Moai statues were born. This was arguably the most isolated human society on Earth, a tiny island over 1,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. Its quarry was not just a workshop, it was the sole source of cultural expression for an entire people. The society that carved the Moai was a closed system. Every log used as a lever, every rope woven from local fibers, every calorie of food that fed the carvers, all of it came from the island's finite resources. For centuries, the system worked, but the archaeological and environmental record tells a story of accelerating pressure. As the statue cult grew more ambitious, forests were cleared for timber and to open land for agriculture. Soil eroded. Bird populations, a crucial food source, dwindled. The quarry at Rororoku operated at a furious pace, producing hundreds of statues, even as the ecological foundation beneath it was being consumed. Then it stopped. Dozens of Moai in various stages of completion were left in the quarry, on the transport roads, and upright in their ceremonial platforms. This was not a strategic pause. This was a system hitting absolute zero. The abandonment was total and final because there was nowhere else to go, no trade partner to call for aid, no frontier to retreat to. The quarry's silence marks the moment the island's carrying capacity was irrevocably breached. The power shift here was not a transfer, but an evaporation. The social hierarchy that commanded the statue work dissolved because the physical means to support it, the food, the timber, the very cohesion of society, had been exhausted within the closed loop of their tiny world. Now cast your eyes to the ancient Near East. to the quarries that supplied the great interconnected empires of the Romans, the Persians, the Assyrians. Here, the map tells a different story. These were open systems woven together by maritime trade routes, paved royal roads, and complex alliances. A quarry in a province like Roman Egypt or Anatolia was not an isolated heartbeat. It was one cell in a colossal organism. When stress came to these systems, the response could be fluid, even calculating. A quarry might be abandoned not because the empire forgot how to work stone, but because it made a cold-eyed strategic decision. Imagine a distant province becoming too costly to hold. Rebel uprisings grow frequent, a rival empire's border presses closer, and the cost of garrisoning legions and maintaining infrastructure outweighs the province's economic return. In such a scenario, the imperial response might be retrenchment. The state would consciously withdraw its resources, its administrators, and its specialized labor forces back toward the secure core territories. The quarry supplying a frontier temple or a remote governor's palace would be deliberately shut down. The tools might be collected, the skilled workers relocated to a safer building project closer to the capital. The abandonment, while sudden for the local population, is a top-down command from a central authority that is very much still alive, just choosing to contract its ambitions to survive. The power shift here is one of strategic contraction, not collapse. The empire lives on, but its footprint shrinks. The abandoned quarry on the periphery becomes an archaeological marker of a receding tide of power, a place where imperial influence was voluntarily rolled back to consolidate strength elsewhere. This comparison reveals a crucial insight. The story a quarry tells is not just about the stone or the workers or even the immediate crisis. It is about the world that surrounded it. An isolated society's abandoned quarry is a tombstone, marking the end of a unique cultural experiment with no exit. An interconnected empire's abandoned quarry is more like a scar, evidence of a strategic wound that the larger body survived, at least for a time. The silence in Rono Raraku is absolute, the end of a song with no echo. The silence in a Roman frontier quarry is relative, just one note fading in a symphony that continued playing hundreds of miles away. This forces us to ask a haunting question about our own globalized age. We have built a planetary civilization, a network of staggering complexity. But does that interconnection make us more resilient, like Rome, able to retreat and regroup? Or have we, in our consumption of global resources, inadvertently recreated the closed, fragile system of an Easter island on a planetary scale, where there is no frontier left to retreat to? The stones, in their eloquent silence, offer no easy answers, only a stark framework for understanding the scale of our own vulnerabilities. A slow, relentless change in the sky can be more destabilizing than any single storm. While a sudden drought might halt a quarry for a season, a fundamental shift in the climate rewrites the rulebook for an entire civilization. We are not talking about a few bad years, but a transformation spanning generations, a new environmental normal that gradually makes the old ways of life and the old monuments impossible. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC provides a haunting template. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Hittite heartland to the Mycenaean palaces, thriving urban societies fractured within a few decades. For over a century, historians debated the causes, pointing to invasions, earthquakes, and social revolt, but a new kind of evidence has tipped the scales. By analyzing microscopic shells in seafloor sediments and the chemistry of ancient ice cores, scientists have reconstructed a precise climate history. The data reveals a prolonged, severe drought lasting for centuries, a period now called the 3.2 Kiloyear event. This was not a temporary hardship, it was a permanent alteration. Rain-fed agriculture failed, famine spread. The carefully managed surplus that fed kings, armies, and the legions of quarry workers evaporated. In this new, drier world, the priorities of power underwent a brutal simplification. The labor and resources needed to extract a 200-ton block for a temple facade were no longer an investment in prestige. They were a lethal drain on survival. The quarries were abandoned because the entire economic and social pyramid they supported was being dismantled, layer by layer, by a changing sky. This pattern repeats with eerie consistency. Centuries later, during the so-called medieval warm period, a time of unusual mildness in the North Atlantic, Viking settlers established farms on the coast of Greenland. For a while it worked, but as that warm phase ended and the climate cooled into what we call the Little Ice Age, the growing seasons shortened, sea ice expanded, and supply lines from Europe were cut off. The settlements, clinging to a European way of life, became untenable. While they did not build megalithic quarries, their story is the same on a human scale. They invested in stone churches, farmsteads, and a social structure that depended on a specific climate. When that climate left them, they had to leave too. The power to sustain their community in that place was revoked by the environment itself. For a megalithic society, this slow-motion crisis would have played out with devastating subtlety. A gradual cooling trend might shorten growing seasons by just a few days each decade, a change almost imperceptible to a single generation. Yet over 50 years, the total yield of the harvest could drop by a crippling margin. The state's ability to feed a non-agricultural workforce, the very foundation of monumental construction, would erode. Populations might begin a slow migration toward more reliable water sources, fragmenting the stable labor pools that quarry masters depended upon. The central authority, straining to maintain order and distribute dwindling resources, would face an unavoidable choice. It could continue to command the old projects, watching its legitimacy crumble as hunger spread, or it could redirect every ounce of effort toward adaptation, toward building irrigation canals instead of temple walls. The choice to abandon the quarry, then, is not a moment of failure, but a late and desperate act of societal triage. It is the recognition that the contract with the environment has been broken, and the energy of the civilization must be spent not on symbols of eternity, but on securing a tomorrow. The stones left in their beds become markers of this profound recalculation. They show us that the most enduring shifts in human power are often not decided in battles or palace coups, but in the silent, cumulative pressure of a changing world, a force that eventually commands even kings to bow and redirect their ambition from glory to survival. The true power of a quarry lay not in the stone, but in the invisible threads that stretched out from it. To move a single megalith was to conduct a symphony of logistics, a supply chain of astonishing complexity that spanned an entire kingdom. The quarry was merely the first note. From there, the stone's journey depended on a fragile web of specialists and resources. Teams of transporters had to build and maintain sledges and rollers from specific, strong timbers. Boat builders along the Nile or the Mediterranean coast had to construct barges of a scale never before attempted, capable of surviving the journey with a 1,000-ton passenger. Rope makers needed acres of hemp fields to produce the thick cables for hauling, and behind it all, a vast agricultural hinterland had to produce a massive, reliable surplus of grain, meat, and vegetables to feed every single person in this chain, from the quarryman to the sailor to the official overseeing the project. This network was the real monument, a living, breathing system of interdependency. When we find an abandoned quarry, we are often looking at the most visible failure in a cascading collapse of this entire network. The silence at the quarry is just the loudest symptom of a systemic illness that had already spread through the body of the state. A single broken link could paralyze the entire operation. Consider the copper and tin needed to forge the bronze chisels that shaped the granite at Aswan. These metals often came from mines hundreds of miles away, in regions controlled by allies or through precarious trade routes. If a key mining region was exhausted, or if hostile tribes blocked the mountain passes those caravans used, the flow of essential tools would stop. The master carvers could not work stone with their bare hands. Or imagine a famine striking the agricultural provinces that supplied the grain for the worker settlements. Even if the quarry itself was untouched, the state would face an impossible choice: divert the dwindling food supply to keep the monument on schedule, or feed the population to prevent widespread hardship and potential revolt. The monument always lost. The logistical network was a chain, and it was only as strong as its most vulnerable point. An empire's power was not just its army or its temples, it was its ability to keep all these threads intact, flowing smoothly from the mine to the field to the quarry floor. When one thread snapped, the entire tapestry could begin to unravel with startling speed. This is why archaeologists investigating these sites look far beyond the chisel marks and half-carved blocks. They search for the wider material culture, the scattered clues that map the ghost of the network. They analyze soil samples in nearby settlements for traces of pollen from distant grains, evidence of imported food. They look for pottery styles that match regions known for producing rope or timber. They study the wear patterns on stone tools to see if a shortage of bronze forced a shift to less efficient methods. By piecing together this evidence, they can start to identify the breaking points. Was it the exhaustion of a local forest that provided the lever timber? Was it a shift in river currents that made barge transport suddenly impossible? Or was it a more profound social rupture where the farmers or transporters, perhaps feeling overburdened or no longer believing in the project's purpose, simply withdrew their labor, breaking the chain of consent that the whole system relied upon? This systemic view forces a dramatic shift in perspective. It reveals that ancient power was not a monolithic force emanating from a throne. It was a delicate equilibrium, a complex dance of resource extraction, specialized labor, and distribution that required constant maintenance and goodwill. The ambition to move mountains was built on a foundation of countless, quiet agreements between different parts of society. When those agreements failed, whether from environmental pressure, economic strain, or lost faith, the rupture could be swift and catastrophic. The quarry did not fail first. It was the last domino to fall, the final, silent testament to a network that had already ceased to function, leaving the grand ambition stranded, quite literally, in the middle of the road. A half-carved obelisk is more than an interrupted task. It is a broken promise. To understand why its abandonment is so devastating, we must look past the logistics and into the human mind. Why would any ruler commit a kingdom's wealth and a generation's labor to moving a mountain of stone? The answer lies in the deep psychology of power. A megalith is the ultimate argument made permanent. It is a statement carved not in parchment or spoken in court, but in the very bones of the earth, intended to outlast dynasties, languages, and gods. Its purpose is psychological warfare on a grand scale, waged against two formidable enemies, time and rivals. Against time, the monument screams defiance. A king knows his reign is brief, his name may fade from memory, but a temple platform built of 200-ton blocks or a needle of granite piercing the sky whispers to every future generation, "We were here and we were mighty." It is an attempt to cheat mortality, to secure a form of immortality through sheer, undeniable mass. Against rivals, both internal and external, the message is one of overwhelming capability. A neighboring kingdom seeing such a project underway understands the resources, the organization, and the absolute confidence required. It is a deterrent written in stone, a display of strength so extravagant it discourages challenge. For the common people toiling to build it, the scale of the endeavor reinforces the divine or absolute nature of the authority commanding them. It makes the ruler's power seem as eternal and unshakable as the stones they are moving. This is why the sudden abandonment is so catastrophic. It is not merely a project cancellation, it is the shattering of that carefully crafted narrative. The half-built monument undergoes a terrible transformation. It ceases to be a symbol of eternal power and becomes instead a monument to impermanence and doubt. That grand ramp leading nowhere, that colossal block stranded in its quarry, they no longer speak of future glory. They speak of a future that evaporated. They become a daily, visible reminder that the vision of the elite has failed. The confidence that held the society together, the belief in a destined, glorious path, evaporates. This loss of prestige can accelerate a power shift with frightening speed. A population that once labored out of belief or fearful, or may now labor only out of direct coercion, a far more fragile bond. Local governors who once competed to contribute to the great work may now see the central authority as vulnerable and begin to withhold their own resources or assert their independence. The abandoned project becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of decline. It broadcasts weakness, inviting the very challenges it was meant to deter. The quarry, therefore, tells a story of shattered confidence. The scattered tools are not just abandoned, they are the physical evidence of a broken spell. The psychological contract between the ruler and the ruled, between the present and an imagined future, has been torn up. What remains is the silent, accusing stone, a testament to the fact that the most solid symbols of power are often the most vulnerable to a single change in the story everyone believes. The story told by a silent quarry is not self-evident. It is a puzzle that must be unlocked, and the key lies in the precise moment the last worker walked away. How can we possibly know with any certainty when that moment occurred? The answer is found in the quiet, meticulous work of modern archaeology, a discipline that has moved far beyond treasure hunting into the realm of forensic science. To read the final page of a quarry's story, experts assemble clues from the earth itself, building a timeline from multiple, independent lines of evidence. It begins with the fundamental principle of stratigraphy, the study of soil layers. In a quarry, each phase of activity leaves a distinct signature. A layer of stone chips and dust marks a period of intense carving. That layer might be covered by a stratum of wind-blown sand or silt, indicating a period when the site was still and exposed. If that sterile layer is then capped by another level of tool debris, we know work resumed. But if the final layer of quarry waste is sealed by an undisturbed, natural accumulation that shows no further human disturbance, we have found the abandonment horizon. It is a geological bookmark placed in time. Complementing this is typology, the study of artifact styles, the specific shape of a bronze chisel, the design of a pottery shard from a worker's meal, or the decoration on a lamp all have known date ranges based on finds from other, well-dated sites. If the latest tools left on the floor are of a style that was common in, say, the late 18th dynasty of Egypt, but nothing from later periods is found mixed in, it strongly suggests work stopped around that time. Yet these traditional methods are now supercharged by laboratory science. One of the most revolutionary techniques is luminescence dating. When minerals like quartz or feldspar are buried, they accumulate natural radiation from the surrounding soil. This radiation charges the minerals like a tiny geological battery. Exposure to sunlight resets this charge to zero. When an archaeologist carefully extracts a grain of sand from beneath a fallen quarry block, a stone that has not seen the sun since the day it was abandoned, they can take it to a darkroom lab. By measuring the faint light or luminescence the mineral emits when stimulated, scientists can calculate how long it has been since that grain was last exposed to sunlight, effectively dating the moment the block fell and was covered. For dating the quarry face itself, researchers might use cosmogenic nuclide dating. When a rock surface is first exposed by human cutting, it begins to be bombarded by cosmic rays from space. These rays create rare, radioactive isotopes within the stone's crystals at a known, steady rate. By measuring the concentration of these isotopes in the freshly cut surface of an abandoned monolith, scientists can determine how many centuries that surface has been staring up at the open sky. Perhaps the most evocative technique involves something as delicate as pollen. Archaeologists take core samples from ancient mud or lake beds near a quarry. Under a microscope, they can identify and count the fossilized pollen grains trapped in each layer. The mix of pollen tells a vivid story. A layer with abundant grass and grain pollen suggests active agriculture and a populated landscape. A sudden shift to pollen from hardy, drought-resistant shrubs or pine trees can signal the onset of a drier climate. By correlating the pollen record from a layer that matches the quarry's abandonment layer, researchers can reconstruct the environmental conditions at that exact moment in history. Was the region lush or arid? Was forest being cleared, or was it reclaiming the land? This multi-pronged approach transforms speculation into empirical fact. It allows us to say with growing confidence that the workers at Ollantaytambo dropped their tools in the mid-1600s, at the peak of the Inca rebellion. It lets us correlate the silence at a Mesopotamian quarry with a specific century of drought recorded in cave stalagmites miles away. This scientific rigor is what elevates the narrative from myth to history. The story of the abandoned quarry is no longer just a haunting mystery. It is a dated event, a data point in the grand and turbulent story of human civilization. The stones are silent, but the earth around them is now speaking with remarkable clarity. These silent quarries force us to ask the biggest question of all. Why do civilizations at their apparent peak suddenly unravel? It is a puzzle that has haunted historians for centuries, leading to sweeping theories that attempt to explain the fate of empires. Two of the most influential thinkers in this realm are Joseph Tainter and Jared Diamond. Tainter argues that societies collapse when their own complexity becomes too costly, when the energy required to maintain the system finally outweighs the benefits it provides. Diamond, on the other hand, focuses on environmental mismanagement, on how civilizations can inadvertently destroy the ecological foundations that support them. These are grand, abstract ideas, but what if we could see them play out not in dusty history books, but in the tangible reality of a quarry floor? These abandoned sites become perfect, stark test cases. A megalithic quarry is by definition the embodiment of peak complexity. It is a node where elite ambition, specialized labor, long-distance logistics, and massive resource extraction all converge. Its very existence screams of a society confident in its surplus and its organizational muscle. So when that site is abandoned, we are witnessing the failure of that complex system in real time. Through Tainter's lens, the quarry's silence is the sound of diminishing returns. For generations, the investment in these monuments paid off. They solidified political power, enforced social hierarchy, and projected divine legitimacy. But over time, the costs kept rising, securing the copper for tools from more distant mines, feeding an ever larger workforce from strained farmlands, maintaining the loyalty of regional governors tasked with supplying labor. All of this required more and more energy from the state. Eventually, a tipping point was reached. The next obelisk, the next temple platform, would cost more than any political or spiritual benefit it could possibly return. The leaders, perhaps unconsciously, made a brutal calculation. Continuing the project risked the entire system. Abandoning it, while a stunning admission of failure, might allow the core of society to survive in a simpler, less ambitious form. The scattered tools are not just left behind. They are the physical evidence of a society choosing to downsize, to walk away from its most complex undertaking in order to preserve itself. Jared Diamond's framework asks us to look just beyond the quarry walls. What was happening to the land that fed this machine? evidence here can be chillingly direct. Soil core samples from nearby lake beds might show a sharp increase in silt and erosion layers right at the time the quarry was active, sediment washed from hillsides cleared for timber or agriculture. Pollen records could reveal a decline in tree species replaced by hardy shrubs, telling a story of deforestation. The quarry itself might show a shift in technology, from efficient bronze tools to cruder stone ones, hinting at a breakdown in distant trade networks for metals. This paints a picture of a society consuming its own future. The very act of feeding the monumental ambition was stripping the landscape of its ability to regenerate. The quarry did not stop because the king lost faith. It stopped because the last suitable tree for a sledge had been cut, or because a changing climate, possibly exacerbated by local environmental damage, could no longer support the agricultural surplus needed for the workers. In this view, the abandoned block is a monument to ecological bankruptcy. The power shift was not just political, it was a bill coming due from the natural world. By examining these quarries through these two powerful lenses, we move from simply describing an event to explaining a process. We see that collapse is rarely one thing. It is often a deadly feedback loop where environmental strain makes complexity more expensive, and that rising complexity accelerates environmental damage. The quarry becomes a diagnostic tool. It lets us test these grand theories against the hard evidence of chisel marks and pollen grains. It links the specific story of a single failed obelisk to the universal patterns of human ambition, reminding us that our greatest constructions are always, ultimately, negotiations with the earth and with the limits of our own social ingenuity. Every signature project begins with a name. Behind the silent quarry at Aswan was the will of Queen Hatshepsut. The fortress stones at Ollantaytambo were commanded by the rebel Inca Emperor Manco. These were not anonymous public works, they were deeply personal endeavors, the chosen instruments through which a ruler sought to write their story directly onto the landscape. To commission a megalith was to attempt a dialogue with eternity, a bid to transform personal ambition into permanent, undeniable fact. The ruler's name would be carved into the finished stone, forever linked to the god it honored and the sky it touched. This makes the abandonment so profoundly personal. It is not just a project that failed, it is a legacy that was interrupted mid-sentence. The unfinished stone becomes a stark, unintended biography, narrating the tragic gap between a reign's grandest dreams and the unforgiving realities that cut them short. When we cross-reference these frozen building sites with the historical records of the rulers who ordered them, a pattern of converging crises almost always emerges. Hatshepsut's reign was one of prosperity and artistic flourishing, but her successor, Thutmose III, had his own ambitions and a possible desire to diminish her memory. The political capital and economic surplus needed to complete her obelisk may have simply evaporated as priorities shifted toward military campaigns in the north. For Manco Inca at Ollantaytambo, the crisis was immediate and existential. His monumental vision for the site was utterly overtaken by the Spanish onslaught. The quarry's silence coincides precisely with the moment his role transformed from sovereign builder to military commander fighting for survival. In these cases, the stone tells a truth the official chronicles might soften. It records the precise moment a ruler's effective power, their ability to command resources and labor toward a non-essential goal, was revoked by circumstance. This reveals a difficult truth about how we measure leadership. We often define the greatness of ancient rulers by what they built, by the temples and monuments that survived them. But perhaps an equally telling metric is found in what they could not finish. An abandoned quarry marks the outer limit of a ruler's reach. It is the point where ambition, however brilliantly conceived, finally outpaced the capability of the system they led. That system includes the treasury's depth, the loyalty of regional governors, the resilience of trade networks, and the faith of the populace. A project begun in a time of plenty can become an unbearable burden in a time of scarcity. The ruler who ordered it is then caught in a terrible bind. To continue is to drain the kingdom's lifeblood for a symbol. To stop is to publicly admit that the royal will is not, in fact, immutable. Thus, the half-carved stone becomes a direct commentary on effectiveness. It asks us to look beyond the grand proclamation and see the fragile web of support required to make it real. A successful megalithic project proves a ruler could marshal that web for decades. An abandoned one proves the web could tear apart in a single season, despite the ruler's continued desire. Sometimes the fracture is external, like an invasion. Other times it is deeply internal, a succession dispute or a revolt that fractures the unified command needed to see a decades-long project through. The Quarry, therefore, is a non-partisan historian. It does not care about the king's divine right or the queen's sophisticated diplomacy. It only records the outcome, the moment the flow of labor and resources was permanently severed. In the end, these sites force us to reimagine the arc of a reign. We must picture not just the triumphant coronation and the glorious finished temple, but also the anxious council meetings as reports of drought or rebellion came in, the agonizing decision to redirect the last shipments of bronze to forge swords instead of chisels, and the final, silent walk through the quarry as the dream was surrendered. The ruler's legacy becomes dual, split between what they achieved and what they were forced to leave behind. The completed monuments speak of their power, but the unfinished ones speak, often more eloquently, of their limits. They remind us that the history of empires is written not only in victories and treaties, but in the quiet places where the work stopped and the stones were left waiting for a future that never came. But the story does not end when the last worker leaves. A silent quarry is not a dead place, it is an open question. What becomes of these colossal, half-finished dreams once the civilization that birthed them is gone? The answer is a second, slower drama of repurposing, looting, and fading memory. For centuries or even millennia after their abandonment, these sites were never truly empty. They entered a new and often ironic afterlife. The most straightforward fate was to become a convenient stone yard. Why quarry a new block from the living mountain when perfectly cut, often magnificent stones were already lying there, waiting? The Romans were masters of this pragmatic recycling. They saw the unfinished obelisks of Egypt not as sacred failures, but as pre-fabricated trophies. Several were shipped across the Mediterranean to grace the forums and circuses of Rome and Constantinople, physical symbols of an empire that could not only conquer lands, but also repurpose the very monuments of the conquered. The power shift here is material and symbolic. The stone that was meant to glorify a pharaoh as a god now glorifies a Roman emperor as a world ruler. The original meaning is stripped away and a new one is imposed, a clear statement that the new power controls not just the present, but can rewrite the physical legacy of the past. Other quarries found humbler, more immediate uses. The deep, sheltered trenches of an extraction site could become natural fortifications, animal pens, or storage caves for later settlers who had no connection to the original builders. At Rono-Roroku on Easter Island, some of the moai still standing in the quarry itself were later adapted by islanders into sacred burial sites, their backs carved with new petroglyphs. The quarry transformed from a workshop into a cemetery, its purpose completely reinvented by the descendants of the very people who had abandoned it. This process of adaptation shows that power is not just about who builds, but about who decides what a thing means long after the builders are gone. Sometimes the repurposing was an act of deliberate erasure. A new religious order seeking to establish its dominance might systematically dismantle a quarry that supplied temples to the old gods, using the stones to build churches or mosques on the very same sacred ground. The physical material remained, but its spiritual identity was forcibly converted. This is perhaps the most profound power shift of all, where the new regime does not just use the old stones, but uses them to bury the old beliefs. Yet for all this activity, many sites eventually slipped into the quiet embrace of oblivion. As centuries turned to millennia, the knowledge of who built these places and why faded into local legend, then into complete mystery. The quarries were swallowed by desert sands, reclaimed by jungle vines, or simply became unremarkable features in the landscape, their staggering scale no longer understood by the people who lived around them. The cultural MEMORY Chinese letter snapped. This forgetting is itself a form of power dynamics. It represents the total victory of time over a civilization's narrative. When no one remembers the name of the king or the purpose of the stone, the monument loses all its intended power. It becomes a natural oddity, a hill, a strange rock formation. Its meaning is reset to zero, awaiting a new interpreter. That interpreter, of course, would be the archaeologist. The modern rediscovery of these sites is the final chapter in this long afterlife. It is a repowering, but of a different kind. The careful brush revealing a chisel mark, the satellite image identifying a buried ramp, the luminescence dating of a grain of sand, these acts restore context. They give back the names, the methods, the crises. They transform the quarry from a mute geological feature back into a historical document. This scientific reclamation is a new form of authority, one based on evidence and analysis rather than divine right or imperial decree. It allows the stones to speak again, not to glorify a ruler, but to tell a more complex and human story of ambition, ingenuity, and fragility. So the life cycle of an abandoned quarry is a continuous loop of meaning-making. It is built by one power, abandoned in a moment of crisis, scavenged or sanctified by a successor, forgotten by time, and finally reconsecrated by science. Each phase represents a different group imposing its own story onto the same physical space. This reveals that power shifts are not merely the dramatic collapses we have traced, but also these slow, subtle processes of reuse and reinterpretation. The stone itself is passive, enduring. It is the stories we tell about it that are constantly, restlessly changing. The stones were moved by many hands, but what was moving the hearts of those who lifted them? A megalithic quarry was not just an economic engine, it was a social experiment on a colossal scale. It tested the very bonds that held a civilization together. At its best, such a project could forge a powerful, shared identity. Imagine the narrative spun by the ruling elite. This is not just a temple for the king, it is a temple for our people, for our gods, for our place in the cosmos. Every citizen who contributed a basket of grain, every farmer who served a season of labor duty, could feel a part of something immortal. The project became a national story, a collective endeavor that transcended individual lives and knit the society together with a common purpose. The rhythmic pounding of stone hammers was a heartbeat of unity, a physical manifestation of a society pulling in one direction. In this light, the quarry was a crucible of cohesion. It gave meaning, structure, and a sense of destiny to daily life. Its successful completion would be a triumph for everyone, proof of their collective strength and divine favor. But this same mechanism had a dark, coercive flip side. That unifying narrative often rested on a foundation of stark inequality and compelled labor. For every artisan who took pride in his craft, there might have been a conscripted farmer torn from his fields during planting season, working under the watchful eyes of overseers. The immense surplus consumed by the project was extracted from the labor of the many to glorify the power of the few. The grand temple on the hill could become, for those straining at the ropes below, not a symbol of shared faith, but a crushing monument to their own subjugation. In this scenario, the quarry was not a unifying force, it was a pressure cooker of resentment. It highlighted and exacerbated class divisions, reminding everyone of their fixed place in a rigid hierarchy. The social contract here was not one of voluntary participation, but of enforced contribution, maintained by a mix of tradition, religious fear, and the threat of punishment. The sudden, final abandonment of such a site is where we can read which of these two dynamics, unity or division, ultimately determined its fate. If the project truly functioned as a unifying, sacred endeavor, its halt would have caused a profound psychological rupture. The shared story that gave people purpose would collapse. The collective identity built around the great work would shatter, leading to widespread disillusionment and a crisis of meaning. Why did the gods allow this? What was our decades of sacrifice for? This loss of communal spirit could be as debilitating as any material shortage, leaving a society spiritually adrift and vulnerable. Conversely, if the project was fundamentally divisive, sustained by exploitation, then its abandonment might be a direct result of that social strain reaching a breaking point. The silence in the quarry could mark the moment the labor force finally said no. This refusal might not be a dramatic, organized revolt, though that is possible. It could be a quieter, more insidious unraveling, a gradual withdrawal of cooperation, a slowdown in work, a silent pact among the workers to no longer invest their energy in a project that only enriched and empowered their oppressors. When the central authority can no longer compel that labor, whether because its gods have deserted, its legitimacy has evaporated, or the people have simply decided their own survival is more important than the king's glory, the project dies. The tools are dropped not in despair, but in defiance or in a redirected focus toward more immediate personal needs. Thus, the abandoned quarry becomes a stark gauge of societal solidarity in its final days. Its frozen state answers a critical question. Was this society held together by a shared dream or by force and fear? The end of the work marks the point where the cost of maintaining that cohesion, whether through genuine belief or through oppressive control, finally exceeded any perceived benefit. For a society bound by belief, the cost became the existential crisis that made the dream irrelevant. For a society bound by coercion, the cost was the escalating resistance of its own people. In both cases, the stones bear witness to a social equation that no longer balanced. They show us that the most ambitious physical constructions are always mirrored by an invisible social architecture, a complex web of consent, compulsion, and shared narrative. When that web tears, the physical construction cannot continue. The quarry, therefore, holds up a mirror to the human community that created it. Its silence tells us less about engineering failures and more about the failure of a story, or the breaking point of a people's patience, revealing that the true foundation of any monument is not rock, but the fragile, ever-shifting ground of human agreement. The sea was the ancient world's superhighway, and some of its greatest quarries were built on its shores. To move a stone weighing hundreds of tons, water was not just helpful, it was essential. The physics are brutally simple. The friction of dragging a megalith over land is immense, requiring thousands of laborers and miles of prepared road. But place that same stone on a barge, and the water bears its weight, allowing a smaller crew with ropes and currents to move it distances that would be impossible otherwise. This is why so many of these monumental sites are found along coastlines or major rivers. The quarry at Aswan was positioned for the Nile. The stones for Stonehenge, according to prevailing theory, were likely quarried in Wales and transported by a combination of rollers, sledges, and most critically, rafts along the coast and up rivers. The moai of Easter Island were carved from the volcanic tuff of Rono Roroku and then somehow moved across the island, possibly using a combination of rocking and wooden sledges. But even that operation would have required a stable society supported by marine resources. The location was a calculated decision, marrying geology with logistics. You did not put your most important quarry just anywhere. You put it where the stone could most easily begin its journey to glory. Therefore, when such a waterside quarry is abandoned, the failure is often not just about the stone or the workers, but about the liquid road itself. A collapse in maritime capability is a uniquely comprehensive disaster. It severs not just one project, but the entire network that project depended upon. Consider what it takes to move a single megalithic block by water. First, you need a specialized vessel, a barge of incredible strength and size, engineered to handle a load that could capsize a normal ship in an instant. Building such a craft required master shipwrights, access to specific, long, straight timbers, and the knowledge of hull design that could only come from generations of nautical experience. Then you needed a skilled crew to navigate this precarious vessel, understanding tides, currents, and weather patterns to avoid catastrophe. Finally, you required safe passage. The route from quarry to construction site had to be free of obstacles, both natural and human. A harbor could silt up from deforestation upstream, becoming too shallow for your deep draft barges. A key river might change its course after a flood, leaving your loading dock high and dry. Or, most ominously, the seas could become lawless. The rise of piracy or naval conflict could make a once reliable coastal highway a zone of unacceptable risk. Losing a single one of these elements, the shipwrights, the timber, the safe route, could bring the entire enterprise to a permanent halt. This adds a stark naval dimension to our understanding of power. A king might have absolute authority over the land, his soldiers patrolling every road. But if he loses control of his waterways, a core component of his power evaporates. He can no longer project force quickly along coasts. He cannot secure the trade that fills his treasury. And most symbolically, he cannot complete the monumental projects that are the very expression of his reign. The abandoned waterside quarry becomes a monument to this lost blue water authority. It suggests that the society no longer commands the knowledge or the security to use the sea as a tool. Perhaps the guild of shipbuilders was decimated by an epidemic, their techniques dying with them. Maybe a rival kingdom's privateers now dominate the coastal routes, making any attempt to move a priceless stone an invitation for plunder. Or possibly, as with Easter Island, the environmental cost of the monument itself destroyed the maritime capability. To move the moai, vast quantities of timber were needed for levers and sledges. If that logging deforested the island, it would have had a cascading effect. No trees means no new canoes for fishing. No canoes means a collapse in protein supply and the loss of the very vessel needed for inter-island trade or escape. The society would have been trapped, starving, and utterly unable to revive the industry that built its statues. The quarry's silence, in this case, is the sound of an ecosystem, and the maritime culture it supported hitting a wall. So when we stand at a coastal quarry and see a half-extracted block forever gazing out to sea, we are looking at more than a paused construction site. We are witnessing a failed negotiation between a civilization and its most efficient medium of ambition. The stone is ready, the workforce might have been ready. But the water, that ancient ally, had become a barrier. This reveals a profound and often overlooked truth about pre-industrial power. True dominance required mastery of multiple realms, not just the land. It required what we might call a logistical triad: control over the source of the material, the labor to extract it, and the route to deliver it. The water-bound quarry proves that the route was as vital as the resource itself. Losing the maritime route did not just delay a project, it rendered the entire quarry obsolete. Its reason for being, its carefully chosen location, was nullified. This shifts our perspective on collapse. It wasn't always that people forgot how to carve stone. Sometimes they forgot how to sail, or they lost the peace required to sail safely, or they cut down the last tree that could have built the boat. The power to shape the land, it turns out, was forever dependent on the power to command the sea, and when that command was broken, the grandest dreams were left stranded on the beach, silent monuments to a vanished horizon. The sky itself was a quarry of meaning, and the stones were its permanent harvest. Some of the most ambitious megalithic projects were not just monuments, but machines for reading the cosmos. They functioned as colossal calendars, their alignments precisely tuned to the solstice sunrise, the equinox moon, or the helical rising of a specific star. The quarry that supplied these stones was not merely a source of material, it was the birthplace of a cosmological clock. The workers were not just moving rock, they were assembling a permanent argument about the order of the universe, an argument dictated by a class of priest astronomers who held immense intellectual power. Their authority rested on a simple, profound claim: they could predict the cycles of heaven and therefore ensure the fertility of the earth and the favor of the gods. The alignment was everything. A deviation of a single degree could render an entire temple spiritually useless, its connection to the divine severed. So what happens when that celestial certainty begins to wobble? Imagine the slow, dawning crisis within the astronomical priesthood. For generations, their predictions, carved into ritual texts and embodied in temple architecture, had held true. The sun would rise perfectly between the appointed stones on the appointed day, affirming their knowledge and, by extension, their right to command the labor of kingdoms. But celestial motion is complex, involving subtle cycles that span centuries. A precession they had not fully accounted for, a gradual shift in the Earth's axis, could over decades cause the sun to rise slightly off its mark. At first, it might be dismissed as an observational error, a trick of the haze, but year after year, the gap between prediction and reality would widen. The solstice sun would no longer kiss the tip of the sacred stone. The star used to time the planting season would appear in the wrong temple window. This was not just an engineering flaw, it was a theological emergency. The priesthood's entire claim to power, their role as indispensable intermediaries between the people and the cosmos, was being publicly, inexorably disproven by the sky itself. The social and political consequences would be catastrophic. The ruling elite who funded the projects based on this celestial mandate would see their legitimacy erode. The farmers who relied on the astronomical calendar for planting might begin to lose faith, turning to local shamans or their own observations. Doubt is a solvent that dissolves the glue of complex societies. In this atmosphere of crumbling certainty, the grand project in the quarry would face a crisis of purpose. Why continue to extract and move a 200-ton block meant to frame a sunrise that no longer aligns? The intellectual rationale for the entire endeavor has evaporated. The quarry might be abandoned not because of war or famine, but because of a failed prediction. The tools are left behind because the idea they served has been discredited. This represents one of the most subtle and profound power shifts possible: the transfer of authority from a closed intellectual elite to empirical reality. The stones, intended to freeze a moment of celestial understanding for eternity, instead become tombstones for that understanding. They mark the point where a cosmology, however beautiful and complex, collided with a more stubborn truth written in the stars. The abandonment is then an act of silent correction. The society, perhaps without even fully articulating it, chooses to stop building its world around a model that the universe itself has rejected. The quarry's silence is the sound of a paradigm shifting, of intellectual power flowing away from the old interpreters of the sky, leaving their magnificent, misguided machine half-built and forever waiting for a dawn that will never arrive as promised. The silent quarries hold a final, deeply human secret. Who truly lifted these stones? For too long, the answer seemed simple: a vast army of men, driven by the lash of a slave master or the command of a king. This image is powerful, but the stones themselves are telling a different story. Archaeology is now listening to a much quieter, more complex truth. By studying the subtle clues left behind, the microscopic wear on a stone hammer, the chemical signatures in the teeth of skeletal remains found in worker settlements, and the very layout of the camps themselves, a new picture is emerging. The workforce was likely a tapestry of specialized roles, and gender may have played a far more integral part than we ever assumed. It is time to reconsider the hands that shaped the world. The traditional view of an all-male labor force is being gently dismantled by evidence. Take the simple stone pounder, a tool used for hours each day to shape granite. The repetitive motion leaves distinctive wear patterns on the bones of the user, a kind of occupational signature. Analysis of skeletal remains from settlements near monumental sites sometimes reveals these patterns on female skeletons as well as male ones. This does not necessarily mean women were heaving 100-ton blocks, but it strongly suggests they were involved in skilled, sustained stonework, perhaps the finer dressing of surfaces or the intricate carving of decorative elements. Other tasks essential to the operation were almost certainly gendered. The production of the immense quantities of rope needed for hauling was a monumental undertaking in itself, likely involving the processing of plant fibers, a task frequently associated with women in many ancient societies. The management of food supplies for thousands, the weaving of textiles for clothing and slings, the production of pottery for storage, all of these formed the critical, unseen backbone of the quarry. To assume only men built these sites is to ignore half of the engine that made them possible. This reframing transforms our understanding of the social world within the quarry. Instead of a monolithic mass of laborers, we might see a community. Specialized craft knowledge could have run in family groups, with skills passed from mother to daughter and father to son. A master stone carver might have worked alongside his family, each contributing to different stages of the process. The worker settlements were not just barracks. They were likely vibrant, organized communities where domestic life and monumental labor were intertwined. The power of the state did not just command muscle, it harnessed entire household economies, drawing on the combined and specialized labor of all its members. This makes the social contract behind the megaliths infinitely more complex. People may have participated not merely out of coercion, but out of a sense of familial duty, craft pride, or a shared investment in a communal destiny. The project was not just imposed from above, it was woven into the very fabric of daily life and identity. When the sudden stop came, the shockwave would have ripped through this intricate social tapestry in devastating ways. The abandonment did not just put men out of work, it shattered entire economic and social units. Consider a family where the women managed a large-scale textile workshop producing hauling ropes, and the men worked the quarry face. The halt of the project would collapse both sides of their livelihood simultaneously. The specialized craft lineage, the accumulated knowledge of how to process fibers for maximum strength or how to read a specific type of stone grain, could be lost in a single generation if the family was dispersed in search of new work. The sudden redistribution of labor would have upended domestic economies. With the state-sponsored work gone, the roles that gave structure, purpose, and sustenance to countless individuals and families evaporated. The power shift at the top did not trickle down evenly. It landed with unique weight on every segment of society. Women, who may have held economic authority within the quarry's support system, could have found their status and security vanishing overnight alongside that of the male stoneworkers. The collapse was not a single event but a cascade of personal and professional endings. Looking at these quarries through a gendered lens does more than correct a historical oversight. It reveals the true depth of the catastrophe. The silence we perceive is not just the absence of hammer strikes, It is the silence of broken conversations between master and apprentice, of empty workshops where looms once clacked, of kitchens that no longer need to feed 1,000. It shows us that ancient power was not built on the backs of a faceless multitude, but on the coordinated efforts of a whole society, with each thread, whether spun by male or female hands, vital to the grand design. When the design was abandoned, every thread was cut. This nuanced view forces a humbling realization. The rise and fall of civilizations is measured not only in fallen obelisks and emptied treasuries, but in the quiet dissolution of countless daily routines, partnerships, and hard-won skills that once, together, believed they were building something for eternity. The stones remain, but the world that gave them meaning, a world of shared labor and intertwined lives, is what truly vanished. That half-carved stone, stranded in its own birthplace, became a story long before it became a subject of science. The silent quarries we have explored did not vanish from human consciousness when the last worker walked away. Instead, they were absorbed into the collective imagination, resurfacing in myths, poems, and paintings as powerful symbols. These artistic echoes are a form of cultural archaeology, revealing how societies long after the fact tried to make sense of such staggering incompleteness. The abandoned megalithic site is more than a historical event. It is a psychological archetype. It speaks directly to our deepest fears about ambition and mortality. So cultures began to weave explanations. In medieval Europe, the colossal stones at places like Baalbek were attributed to a race of giants, or to the biblical figure Nimrod. These were not ignorant tales, they were logical conclusions drawn from a limited worldview. If your society cannot conceive of moving a 1,000-ton block, then the beings who did must have possessed supernatural strength or divine assistance. The story becomes a way to domesticate the awe-inspiring, to fit the impossible into a familiar narrative framework, even if that framework involves giants and magic. This myth-making process often served a dual purpose. It explained the physical mystery of the stones while also delivering a moral lesson. The crack in the unfinished obelisk at Aswan for later generations was not a geological flaw. It was a sign from the gods, a divine punishment halting the work of a prideful pharaoh. Here, the quarry transforms from a failed construction site into a cautionary tale about hubris. The narrative shifts from logistics to morality. The stone becomes a permanent sermon, warning against overreaching ambition and the fleeting nature of earthly power. This theme found a profound home in the Romantic era of the 18th and 19th centuries. Artists and poets, disillusioned with rigid industrial order, sought out ruins as symbols of the sublime, places where nature was reclaiming human ambition. An abandoned quarry, with its raw, unfinished stones being slowly embraced by vines and weather, was the perfect romantic subject. It represented the thrilling tension between human creation and natural decay. For poets like William Wordsworth or Percy Shelley, such a site was not a failure but a poignant meditation. It spoke of time's vastness, reducing even the greatest works of kings to fragmented, beautiful relics. The quarry became a landscape of melancholy reflection, where one could contemplate the inevitable passing of all empires and the quiet, persistent power of the natural world. This artistic legacy flows directly into our modern era. The imagery of the abandoned megalithic workshop is a staple of fantasy, literature, and cinema. It is the ancient dwarven hall of Khazad-dûm in Lord of the Rings, a magnificent stone city found silent and overrun, its forges cold. It is the mysterious, half-built structures on lost planets in science fiction, hinting at a vanished alien civilization that reached for the stars and fell short. These fictional quarries are never just settings, they are characters in their own right, heavy with narrative purpose. They evoke a sense of deep time and forgotten epochs. They force our heroes, and by extension us, to ask the same questions we have been exploring. What happened here, what kind of people built this, and what caused them to stop? The power of this trope lies in its resonance with a universal human anxiety, the fear that our own grand projects, our cities, and our technologies might one day be just as incomprehensible to those who come after. This cultural processing through art and story is a crucial part of the quarry's legacy. It proves that the power shifts these sites represent are not cold historical facts. They are human experiences that transcend time. They touch on our shared vulnerability, our awe in the face of time, and our need to find meaning in fragments. The stones themselves are silent, but the stories we tell about them are a constant, evolving conversation. Each legend, each poem, each cinematic scene is an attempt to answer the quarry's unspoken question, not with data but with feeling. It is how we, as a species, grieve for lost worlds and caution our own. The artistic echo, therefore, completes the circle. Archaeology tells us how the work stopped. Logistics explains why it might have stopped, but art and literature explore what that stopping means for the human spirit. They remind us that history is not just about what was built or abandoned, but about how those acts continue to haunt and inspire us, shaping our myths and our metaphors for millennia after the last chisel has fallen silent. That artistic echo resonates because it taps into a timeless human anxiety, one we feel not just about the past but about our own towering world. The silent quarries are not just ancient history, they are a mirror. We no longer carve obelisks from granite, but we launch constellations of satellites into the silent quarry of space. We do not move 1,000-ton stones, but we pour millions of tons of concrete for dams that reroute entire rivers, or we tunnel through mountains for particle colliders that seek the secrets of the universe itself. These are our megaliths. They are the megaprojects of our age, born from the same cocktail of ambition, technological confidence, and the desire to leave a mark that will define our civilization for centuries to come. And just like the quarries of old, they depend on a fragile web of stability. They require decades of unwavering political will, budgets that span generations, a global consensus of scientific cooperation, and a steady supply of both rare materials and public goodwill. The question the ancient stones pose to us is not whether we can build these things. We clearly can. The question is whether we can sustain them. What would it take for us to walk away from a half-built city on another world, or to let a skeleton of a fusion reactor stand silent against the sky? The patterns from the past suggest the triggers have not changed, only their scale. A sudden geopolitical realignment could freeze an international scientific project overnight as partners withdraw and funding evaporates. A profound economic shift, a depression that redefines what a society considers essential, could see a decades-long infrastructure project deemed a luxury it can no longer afford. Most pressingly, an accelerating environmental crisis could force a brutal triage of priorities, where resources dedicated to a monument of knowledge or energy are desperately redirected toward immediate adaptation and survival. The ancient quarry masters never imagined their world could change so fast. We, however, have no such excuse. We can see the potential fractures in our own systems with terrifying clarity. We debate the sustainability of mining asteroids or the ethics of geoengineering, recognizing that our reach is extending into realms with consequences we cannot fully recall. The lesson from Aswan and Baalbek is not that ambition is futile. It is that ambition is most vulnerable when it becomes disconnected from the living, breathing foundation that supports it. When the pharaoh's obelisk became more important than the fertility of the Nile Valley that fed the workers, the project was living on borrowed time. Are we making the same calculation? Does our drive to build a permanent human presence on Mars outpace our commitment to stabilize the climate of our only home? Does the dream of a space-based solar power network depend on a degree of international peace and cooperation that is currently receding? The abandoned quarries teach us that collapse is rarely about forgetting how to do something. It is about a sudden, severe misalignment between a society's grandest goals and its practical ability to pursue them. The tools are not lost, they are simply set down when the purpose they serve is instantly overridden by a more urgent reality. So as we look at our own blueprints for the future, etched not in stone but in light on computer screens, we must listen to the silence of those ancient work sites. They urge us to check the foundations. They ask us to consider which of our modern megaliths are built on rock and which are balanced on sand, awaiting the first tremor that will force a generation to make a choice we think only ancient people had to face, to leave the dream half-finished and turn with all our might toward securing a tomorrow. The story of a single cracked obelisk is never just about the stone. It is the end point of a cascade where different kinds of pressure begin to amplify one another until the entire system buckles. To understand these final moments, we must move beyond looking for a single cause, a silver bullet that felled every civilization. The evidence from these quarries resists such simplicity. Instead, it points us toward a more nuanced and unsettling truth, a multi-causal model for collapse. Think of an ancient society not as a statue, solid and unchanging, but as a mobile, a delicate balance of interconnected parts. One part is the environment, the climate, and the fertility of the land. Another is the economy, the flow of goods and labor. Another is the social fabric, the bonds of belief and cooperation. And the last is the political structure, the authority that tries to hold it all together. For a time they hang in equilibrium, then a shift begins. A prolonged drought, verified now in ice core records, stresses the environmental peace. Crops fail. The economic peace trembles as food stores dwindle and trade routes dry up. This scarcity frays the social peace, breeding hardship and eroding trust in the old ways. As discontent grows, the political peace, the ruling elite, finds its legitimacy questioned. It can no longer command the surplus or the willing labor for its grand projects, because every ounce of energy is now needed for basic survival. In this model, the abandoned quarry is not the cause of the collapse. It is the symptom. It is the physical manifestation of a feedback loop that has spun out of control, where environmental stress triggers economic pain, which fuels social unrest, which paralyzes political will. The workers did not leave the quarry because of one bad harvest. They left because the drought meant there was no food to pay them, because their families back in the villages were hungry and angry, and because the king's promise of eternal glory suddenly seemed like a cruel joke when the present was falling apart. This framework helps explain why societies that seemed invincible could unravel with such shocking speed. They were not knocked over by a single blow, but suffocated by a convergence of crises. A military invasion might succeed not because the army was weak, but because it was underfed and underpaid due to prior economic strain. A new religious sect might gain followers not because its theology was superior, but because the old gods and the kings who served them had failed to bring rain. The system's resilience was slowly drained by multiple leaks, until one final event, perhaps a modest one, became the tipping point. This multi-causal view discourages the romantic, simplistic stories of curses or single catastrophic battles. It forces us to see these ancient peoples not as foolish or doomed, but as participants in a complex, adaptive system that was navigating a world of real limits. Their monumental quarries were the ultimate test of that system's health. When the work stopped forever, it was a sign that the system had reached a breaking point on multiple fronts simultaneously. The stones were left because every alternative path had been exhausted. The engineers knew how to move them, the artisans knew how to carve them, but the society, as an integrated whole, could no longer muster the coherence, the resources, or the shared belief to see the task through. It is a humbling reminder that our greatest achievements are always supported by a fragile web of conditions. and that the most dramatic falls often begin with a series of quiet, interconnected failures that we ignore until the moment the last chisel is set down, never to be picked up again. A half-built spaceport standing silent on a windswept plain would speak a language any ancient quarry master would understand. Future archaeologists, sifting through the sediment of our own era, will not need to decipher our written records to grasp the pivotal moments of our age. They will read them directly in the industrial landscapes we leave behind. A deserted semiconductor fabrication plant, its clean rooms contaminated by dust, its stockpiles of rare earth elements untouched, would be a modern-day unfinished obelisk. It would tell a story not of a flawed stone, but of a fractured global supply chain, a geopolitical rift so severe it halted the production of the very brains of our civilization. A coastal metropolis like Miami or Bangkok, partially submerged and abandoned, its skyscrapers acting as modern reefs, would be a more devastating quarry. It would not show where we stopped extracting stone, but where we stopped believing a place could be saved, marking the precise horizon where the cost of adaptation finally exceeded the will to invest. These sites will be our time capsules, and the story they tell will be one of interconnected fragility. The silent data server farm, powered down forever, will reveal our dependence on a constant, delicate flow of energy. The vast, fallow fields of a failed geoengineering project will show our ambition to control the climate, and the moment we realized our models were incomplete or our politics too divided to proceed. These future investigators will piece together our priorities not from our speeches, but from our scars. They will see that we poured incredible resources into mastering virtual worlds and artificial intelligence, while the physical infrastructure of our cities aged and strained. They will note the abrupt transition in the archaeological layer, where deposits of certain plastics and alloys suddenly cease, replaced by simpler, localized materials, signaling the great simplification that followed a period of profound disruption. This perspective is a necessary humbling. It places our frantic, present-tense anxieties within the long, patient arc of deep time. We are not the first civilization to believe our achievements were permanent, nor will we be the last to leave behind puzzling fragments of that belief. The power shifts we are living through, the realignments of global influence, the urgent transitions in energy, the migrations driven by a changing planet, will be crystallized in the places we were forced to walk away from. Those sites will testify to the moment a calculation changed, when the return on a $1 trillion investment vanished because the world it was built for no longer existed. So the next time you see a construction site paused indefinitely or read about a grand project cancelled, consider it not just as a news item but as a potential artifact. It is a data point in the story future scholars will tell about the early 21st century, a story of a civilization that reached for the stars while the ground beneath it shifted, leaving behind a new kind of quarry where silicon and steel take the place of granite, waiting silently for the interpreters of a distant future to ask, with the same curiosity we now direct at the past. Happened here, and why did they stop? Silence is the final entry in these stone diaries. From the sun-scorched granite of Aswan to the wind-swept volcanic slopes of Rono-Raraku, these abandoned quarries are far more than archaeological curiosities. They are the stark, physical journals of civilizations in their most vulnerable moments, written not in ink, but in the abrupt absence of sound and motion. They tell us that the great shifts in ancient power were often not smooth, diplomatic transitions. They were sudden, traumatic events that severed the most ambitious dreams mid-thought, leaving the proof frozen in half-carved stone. To walk through one is to stand in the footprint of a vanished certainty. The story is there in the scattered tools, a silent testament to a workforce that evaporated. It is in the frozen logistics of ramps leading nowhere, a kingdom's economic muscle left to atrophy. It is in the half-shaped faces of gods, a theological promise abruptly withdrawn. By learning to read these clues, we are not just studying ancient engineering. We are studying the anatomy of fragility. We see how a society's dazzling complexity can become its greatest liability when the world changes. We witness the profound impact of a shifting environment, a drought or a deforestation that quietly unravels the threads of an empire. And we are forced to confront the most unsettling lesson of all, that authority, for all its temples and proclamations, is a story that people choose to believe, and that story can lose its power in a single generation. These are not distant academic observations. They are urgent reminders for our own time, etched in stone. They challenge us to look at our own towering projects, our global networks and climate interventions, and ask with new eyes, where are our points of fracture? What unseen dependencies make our modern world possible, and how resilient are they? The silent quarries urge us to build not just for scale, but for adaptability, to weave wisdom and humility into the foundations of our own ambitions. As we leave these ancient workshops behind, their quiet is not empty. It is full of questions. It asks us to reflect on the monuments we are building today, in code and concrete and policy, and to consider what future generations might read in our own abandoned sites. What story will our frozen moments tell? If this journey into the echoes of lost power has given you a new perspective, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. For more explorations into the deepest mysteries of our past, be sure to subscribe.